I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce today's guest presenter, Casey McCulloch. Casey McCulloch is the Vice President of Global Sales and Marketing for Premier Biotech. Casey started with Premier in 2010 and has worked with dozens of top 100 retailers, staffing organizations, and manufacturing companies to implement more efficient, compliant, and cost-effective solutions for pre-employment drug testing, specifically using point-of-care oral fluid. Casey was instrumental in collaborating with the development of the OT Scan mobile app, an algorithm which automates the test interpretation and eliminates the test subjectivity. As Vice President of Sales and Marketing, Ms. McCulloch oversees Premier Biotech's 4 sales organization teams, including government, workplace, clinical, and international roadside testing. AccuSource partners with Premier Biotech to provide our clients with high-quality, on-site substance abuse testing products and technology-based tools for managing test results. Now I will turn over the presentation to Casey.
Thanks, Heidi, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you that are joining today. I will go ahead and get into the body of the presentation here. A quick overview in terms of the agenda. We'll talk specifically about rapid testing, defining what does that actually include, what does it mean, and what is the goal of it. We'll look at some of the rapid testing advantages, and then more specifically diving into certain point-of-care products along with the OT Scan mobile reader. And then probably the most important part of the presentation will be focusing on how do we continue to implement effective and successful pre-employment drug testing, as well as post-accident and reasonable cause in the midst of the COVID pandemic and the challenges that presents. So with that, we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about rapid testing. And before we jump into some of the advantages of it, I want to make sure that we define what it is. And so rapid testing is referring to any test that will give you a result in minutes. So it goes by many names, whether it's instant testing, point of care testing, or point of collection testing, sometimes just the acronym POCT, or on-site testing. These are all referring to this concept of rapid testing, and that you don't need to send somebody out to a traditional urine-based collection site, and or you don't have to send samples out to a laboratory for testing. Rapid testing can apply to both urine and oral fluid testing. So, it's designed for speed and ease of use as a way to conduct testing virtually anywhere at any time. And it most importantly, either expediting the hiring process to get people to work immediately or get them back to work immediately. And so if we're talking about the pre-employment context, and many of you may know this, but Quest Diagnostics puts out their annual drug testing index every year. And pre-employment positivity rates based on traditional urine-based collections are around 4 to 5%. And so essentially what that means is that 95 to 96% of the time that pre-employment test is negative. And so if we're using a rapid test, we're able to expedite the hiring process 95, 96% of the time and get that candidate to work immediately. We get a lot of initial interest and engage pretty early on with different retailers, manufacturing companies, hospitality, for their return to work testing, whether it's post-accident or reasonable cause, because this tends to be a huge pain point for these organizations, in that if you've got somebody on the floor and they get into an accident, let's say they crash a forklift or something happens with the forklift, traditionally, if we're using the standard collection site model, and I guess I should first say that most of the time accidents tend to happen at the worst time, so either at night or on the weekends, where accessibility to the collection sites is often really limited and expensive. But the main pain point or the problem with this in the post-accident context is that Now we have a situation where we need to get that person off the floor, and typically we either provide them transportation or we also remove a manager from the floor to take them to a collection site where you're now going to wait who knows how long in a waiting room for them to conduct a traditional urine test. Then you have to wait for that urine test to come back to the lab. And many times companies need to pay for their employees' time while they're out, while they're temporarily suspended waiting for those results. So it can be an extremely costly and inefficient way to conduct testing. So in a lot of instances where we engage with prospects that are interested in exploring rapid testing, their immediate interest is sometimes solving this post-accident problem, and then they quickly realize the advantages that it offers from the pre-employment sense. But again, most important part is to remember that rapid testing can include both urine as well as oral fluid testing. If we take a look at rapid urine testing, obviously the advantages are it can be done anywhere, anytime. Essentially, this is where you would have an employee or some type of medco or nurse performing the test on site, which would still yield that immediate result. Urine testing has been around for a really long time. It's very widely studied, and we know that the accuracy is really good. Obvious limitations are that, of course, there's an ick factor. We see staffing companies and sometimes manufacturing companies are more comfortable handling urine, but by and large, if we're talking about retailers and other larger organizations, they're not necessarily interested in bringing urine testing in-house. Part of the challenge with that is that it would require access to a private restroom. And typically for best practice for a urine-based rapid test, you would want to blue the toilet water, make sure that you're turning off their access to the donor's access to water, making sure that we're checking their pockets for any type of bleach or cleansing agent, oxidizing agent that they could potentially use to adulter or tamper the test results. So of course, just to reiterate and summarize, limitations of rapid urine testing are, although it's cost effective, we've got the ick factor. We have to have a way to control a private restroom, and then adulteration in general, not just with rapid urine testing, but urine testing in general. So as many of you probably know, you can do a quick Google search and there's thousands of ways that are suggested to beat a drug test, whether it's a little bit of bleach underneath a urine drug test, that is, whether it's a little bit of bleach underneath a fingernail. We've heard of Visine drops in the specimen to kill any drug that may be present, synthetic urine that even has little heating packs to keep it within a valid range. But really the easiest way to beat a urine test is drinking a lot of water to dilute any drug that may be present. So of course, donors are getting more and more sophisticated in terms of how to cheat these tests. And so when we think about Quest Diagnostics Drug Testing Index and why is the pre-employment positivity rate only 4 to 5%, well, part of that is because in essence, drug testing is a deterrent, but it's also somewhat of an intelligence test, right? Does somebody know they're coming in for a drug test, and do they stop using drugs? And the second piece of that is that with a urine test, there are lots of ways to adulter or cheat the test. And so we've seen this adoption to oral fluid testing because one of the biggest advantages of oral fluid testing is that it is 100% observed. We don't need a private restroom or, of course, in the workplace, we don't do observed collections, but in corrections and the clinical environment, they're conducting observed collections where somebody's actually in the restroom with them, which would require somebody of the same gender. The nature of oral fluid testing in general is that our saliva completely refreshes itself every 10 minutes. And so as long as somebody doesn't have anything in their mouth 10 minutes prior to the test, there's nothing that we've identified to be able to beat or cheat these tests. Probably the biggest, and I'll say the other advantage of oral fluid testing is that it allows for immediate detection of a drug. So we get questions all the time, and perhaps in addition to adulteration, one of the other limitations of urine testing is that in urine, you're testing for a drug's metabolite. So we have to take the drug, our body has to break it down and metabolize, and then we're testing for those metabolic byproducts in the urine. So depending on the drug and an individual's metabolism, that takes between 6 and 14 hours to happen. So if we have an instance where we suspect maybe over lunch break, somebody just used and they're coming back to work and something doesn't seem right, the odds are if we were to give that person a urine test or to send them out for a traditional collection site urine test, that would come back negative because the body hasn't metabolized it yet. With oral fluid testing, there's a lot of studies done, but users actually report that they can taste the cocaine or whatever the drug is before they can feel it because it immediately crosses into our oral fluid. So instantaneously, within minutes after use, we can pick that up in oral fluid. So it's a fantastic solution for, again, reasonable cause or any type of post-accident to find out what's going on. One of the biggest limitations of oral fluid detection or oral fluid testing in general is the detection of THC. So for most of the drugs, and we'll go into this in a little more detail later in the presentation, most of the drugs are water soluble. So if you talk about amphetamine, methamphetamine, opiates, cocaine, and so there's not a significant difference in terms of how long that can be detected in urine versus oral fluid. But THC is fat soluble. And so it's not secreted directly into our saliva. And as a result, we're testing for residual parent drug or smoke or parent edible that's remaining in the mouth. And because of this, we're limited to, with a rapid oral fluid test, 24 hours after use. One of the things I would say that is most interesting perhaps is that if you were to have asked me this question 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said that this is one of the obviously biggest and pronounced limitations of oral fluid testing. But now, because of the climate that we're in terms of states legalizing marijuana, and quite frankly, I get calls almost every day from major employers that are asking, how can we remove THC from the drug testing panel? Because not that I don't want to say that they don't care about it, but they're much more concerned with narcotics and the prescription pain pills that are expensive. And those are the drugs that are A, driving crime on the streets, and B, leading to theft because people have to steal to support their expensive habit. And so now this more limited window of detection for THC has actually somewhat become a benefit because they're treating it more like alcohol, right? So we don't necessarily care in the workplace if somebody drank over the weekend. We care if they're showing up to work drunk and they're working under the influence. We're seeing THC treated in much more of a similar fashion in that maybe we don't care so much about what happened over the weekend, but we want to make sure that people aren't smoking right before or at work. So as I've described all of these advantages and limitations in terms of urine versus oral fluid testing, I think it's really important to make sure to reiterate again that it's not an apples to apples comparison. Because of the different advantages and limitations of urine versus oral fluid testing, we could very realistically get different results depending on the methodology that we're using. So for instance, most notably is probably if we're talking about THC. So if we have a negative in oral fluid and a positive in urine, we would think that's pretty easily explained in that it's a detection window issue, right? Where maybe we tested them after 24 hours of them using it. And as a result, we're not seeing that in the oral fluid anymore, but we're still able to pick that up in the urine. If we're talking about, let's say, opiates, for instance, and we have a positive oral fluid, but a negative in the urine, well, maybe that's because of adulteration. And the person did something to tamper with the urine specimen, but because the oral fluid test is observed, they weren't able to cheat that. Or perhaps it's because they recently used and that drug hasn't yet metabolized and it's not showing up in the urine, but we're able to pick that up in the oral fluid testing before we are in the urine test. So again, because of the different advantages and limitations, it's very important to know we could realistically get a different result depending on that methodology. This graph, I think, does a really good job in just illustrating some of the differences in detection windows. So this purple line here is showing oral fluid or saliva-based testing. So we see that this line in the middle, if the dot or the point is below it, it indicates a negative result. And any line or spot up here above it indicates a positive result. So we see when we're looking at oral fluid immediately after use. We're able to pick that up as positive. And then, within a couple of days, that depending on the drug. So with the water soluble drugs, which is basically anything but THC and benzos, we're able to pick that up for, on average, about 1 to 3 days. Again, for THC, we're limited to 24 hours. If we look at urine testing, after somebody uses, we see that we can pick that up from about a half a day, and again, that's depending on the drug, to about 5 days. There's so many variables that affect windows of detection. So probably one of the most common misconceptions we hear is that people say, if I were to ask, how long does THC stay positive in urine? Most often I get an answer of 30 to 45 days. And while that is true, that we have recorded patients that are donors that have had positives for that long, more realistically, when we're talking about a weekend warrior that maybe smokes on the weekends, maybe Thursday, Friday, Saturday, they don't during the rest of the week, we're looking more like 2-3 days. If they drink a lot of water and exercise, maybe less. So I think, again, we tend to think of THC as if somebody smokes one time, we're going to pick that up for a month, and that's just absolutely not the case. Hair testing, which we don't see too often in the workplace, is unique in that we're not going to actually even start picking that up until after a week after use, and then we can tend to get that, sometimes it's longer than a week, until a couple months after use. So it could be a great way to have in fact, drug-free workplace, but it's very difficult in terms of using that as an application of post-accident reasonable cause, what's going on right now, because that's really kind of a reflection of what happened a month ago. We talked about all these variables, and again, I won't go through each of these bullets here, but just understanding that there are a number of variables that affect these detection windows, which is why I think a lot of times customers want a hard, day, like how long does THC stay present? And the reality is it's just a more complicated question than that, because all of these things factor into it. So let's talk a little bit about why employers are making this switch, and we're seeing this adoption of rapid oral fluid testing. And so, obviously hiring qualified candidates while ensuring a drug-free workplace is of critical importance now more than ever. And as employees are setting out to fill open positions or bring people back to work, they're running the risk of losing candidates due to their inability to make on-the-spot job offers. So we're seeing patient service centers or collection sites either closing, or they're choosing not to conduct drug testing right now, just primarily because it's a safety concern potentially to have crowded waiting rooms full of people, and especially restrooms where people are congregating. It's very difficult to disinfect at the speed at which and the turnover at which they're running. And so we're seeing, and we'll talk more specifically about why rapid oral fluid testing really is a good solution to maintain that social distance. But this is a way for employers to continue to drug test, because that is absolutely important. And we'll talk more specifically about how we're kind of in the middle of a crisis within a crisis right now, and that before the COVID pandemic really started, we were in the middle or at the peak of this opioid epidemic. And now we have a situation, right, where people are at home, they're bored, they're stressed, they're nervous, they have anxiety, and what results from that? Well, we see this skyrocketing use in alcohol and drugs. And so rapid oral fluid testing, we're seeing huge increase in inquiries and just moving over to this solution as a way to still conduct drug testing, save money, and provide a safer solution or alternative to traditional urine-based testing. So we talk about rapid oral fluid testing advantages. Cost savings are obviously one of the biggest pieces. So if we're talking about a traditional urine collection site in which we would extend a job offer and then send that person to some patient service center or collection site in which they show up, they wait their turn, they provide a urine sample, that sample is sent out to the lab and they get the results in 2 to 3 days. The majority of the cost is in that actual collection. So it's the employee that is employed by the collection site that is actually conducting that collection. Also, if we're talking about a post-accident scenario, we have time away from work, and we have to consider other job-related costs in terms of paying somebody while they're out, while we're waiting for those results. We talked a lot about adulteration, but again, we know that positivity rates for oral fluid testing are actually higher than those of urine testing, primarily because people can't cheat these tests. So it's interesting to think about, right? Because we know that we're limited in terms of THC detection in oral fluid. We know we're missing some THC positives in a rapid oral fluid that we would pick up in a urine. However, we still see higher positivity rates for oral fluid testing because people can't cheat those tests. So again, really interesting, and just the different advantages and limitations. And even though we acknowledge we're missing some THCs, that's a reality, and I'm always very forthcoming with prospects and customers that is a limitation. But again, we are seeing, because you can't cheat the test, we actually see more true positives. The benefit of the instant results is obviously, right, we are able to execute a drug test right upon job offer and essentially get that person to work either right then or maybe next day, as opposed to waiting the 24 to 48 hours for a traditional laboratory-based test. So this is a way that I like to outline the best practice procedure in terms of using a rapid oral fluid test. So I'll kind of go through this flow chart here. So if this blue, we're going to administer the oral tox or some rapid oral fluid test. If that's negative, which we know in pre-employment is 95% of the time, nothing else has to be done. That candidate can begin work immediately. If it's non-negative, and we never want to use the word positive based on a screen. This is a preliminary screen that uses the same technology as a laboratory-based screen. So if you were to send this out to a Quest or a LabCorp, and the process is they run a screen. If that screen is negative, they report that out. If it's non-negative, that goes on for more highly complex confirmation testing. We treat oral tox the exact same way. So if it's non-negative, then we have a few options. We can either send the oral tox itself or the rapid oral fluid device itself in for confirmation testing, and we can perform that on the exact same sample that we did for the screen. Or we can use the rapid oral fluid test, throw it in the trash, pretend like it never existed, and ask that donor to report to a urine collection site, basically the same traditional process that exists today, in which the laboratory then would handle that confirmation testing. Either way, it doesn't matter. What matters is that we're performing a high complexity confirmation test. Only upon that confirmation test would we refer to a result as positive, in which case the candidate would not be eligible for hire. If it does come back positive, of course, following best practice procedure and laws, we would have an MRO engage and reach out to that individual to obtain a valid prescription. And of course, if the MRO overturns that result, then we can clear that candidate for work. But again, the major thing to take away from this is that we're using the rapid oral fluid test to weed out, no pun intended, the negative and get them to work immediately and save a bunch of money in doing that, because it's much more cost effective than sending them out. Plus, and again, we'll talk about this in a few slides from now, we are able to administer a test, which is a donor-driven process in which we're able to maintain that 6 feet of recommended separation. And so we're providing a safer solution than sending somebody out to a crowded collection site. So I think when we talk about drop-off rates, that's something that resonates with all of our clients. One of our major staffing companies did a study last busy season, and they estimated that 60% of their candidates in which their clients were requiring a traditional laboratory collection site, 60% of the time that drug test was ordered, it never took place. Now, some of that is probably because the donor didn't have transportation, or they had a conflict in schedule, or maybe they showed up to the collection site and they found out that they had a 50 to a 75-minute wait. And they said in the competitive hiring environment, especially last season that we were in, they said, forget it. I'm going to go across the street where I can get a job right away. And so, again, drop-off rates are something that resonate with everybody, and we don't have to worry about this with a rapid oral fluid test. We can conduct the test right away and get that person to work before they even leave. So we've offered them a job, we conduct the drug test, and now we can place that person. So this next slide here just goes on to reiterate the same things that we talked about. It outlines the collection site screening process in which we establish which collection site we're going to send them to. The candidate needs to show up within a certain period of time. We have issues with transportation or accessibility, and then we wait for these results. Versus a rapid testing solution in which we can conduct the test anytime, anywhere, by anyone. It's a donor-driven process in which our clients, so staffing companies, retailers, manufacturing companies, their HR or the test administrator doesn't really even have to touch the test. The donor is driving that process. We eliminate the drop-off issues, and we can make employment decisions immediately. And at the same time, the biggest impact, right, is saving hundreds of thousands, if not, depending on the size of the program, obviously even millions on drug testing. What's interesting if we talk about what is kind of driving this adoption curve to rapid testing, the background check and the evolution of the background check has really had a lot to do with that. So historically, background checks were the bottleneck in the onboarding process. Because of the way that it worked, companies had to wait, up to 5 days, maybe longer, for the background check to be executed. So in that time, it didn't necessarily matter that you had to wait 2 to 3 days for a drug test result because you couldn't get that person to work before that background check was completed anyway. Now with AI and automation around background checks, they can be completed in under an hour, which now leaves the traditional collection site lab-based urine test the bottleneck. And so when we hear this emphasis about the onboarding experience and the candidate experience and how do we really streamline that process, what we're seeing is companies are trying to complete that whole process in under an hour, which really, solves that problem in terms of how do we make this as efficient as possible. So here we just kind of outline what we talked about before in terms of we don't want the drug test to be the bottleneck. And so when we're talking about a rapid oral fluid test, that takes minutes, let's say 45 minutes for the background check. Now we can have that candidate to work within, under an hour. And, I continue to reiterate this eliminating of the drop-off rate. Another thing I wanted to talk about, because we've seen this adoption of oral fluid testing. So there are a lot of large companies and small companies that have bought into the concept of why oral fluid testing is advantageous over urine testing, in that it prevents adulteration, right? And it's a less invasive process. But a lot of companies are utilizing a laboratory-based oral fluid solution. And the way that process works is, and every lab does it, so Quest, LabCorp, Premier Biotech, us, we have a lab-based solution as well. We use the Intercept or the OraSure's i2 device. But the problem in this, in terms of pre-employment testing, is that you're doing 90% of the work in the collection itself. So the way that the lab-based oral fluid test works is that you eliminate the collection cost in sending somebody out to the Quest or the LabCorp or the Concentra, wherever they're going. And you eliminate the drop-off rate because you're going to conduct that drug test right there while that candidate is sitting there. You're going to give them this swab where they collect oral fluid and put it into a vial. And then we're going to package that up, have it accompanying a chain of custody form, set off to the lab, in which we'll get those results back on average 2 days later. So the benefits are we prevent adulteration, which we see in urine testing, and we prevent the drop-off rate because now I'm going to give this person the test right while they're there, so I don't have to worry about them showing up to that collection site. We maybe can save a little bit, and I'm talking like maybe $5, in that the collection of the urine test is typically the most expensive piece. But the problem is that the most expensive piece of the lab-based oral fluid test is the shipping. We've got to overnight this, which is really costly. And again, we're doing 90% of the work, maybe even more than that, because we have to fill out the chain of custody forms and put the security seals over and package it up without any of the benefits of the immediate results. And so, again, I like to break this down just because a lot of times I'll talk to companies that say, yeah, I'm already doing oral fluid testing. And then it takes a little while before we dive in and really discover, okay, great, you are utilizing oral fluid testing, but it's a laboratory-based solution. So let's talk about how do we really benefit from implementing a rapid testing program. I should back up and say both laboratory-based as well as rapid offer the benefits in the COVID environment of being a donor-driven process in which, again, the donor is going to put the swab in their own mouth, keep it there for the duration of time, put it back into the vial, and you can really maintain and adhere to that 6 feet of recommended social distancing. So both of them are great solutions for that. But again, there's just limitations in terms of how do we get all the benefit of this immediate result. So let's transition a little bit more in talking about pre-employment screening during the COVID pandemic. And again, workplace remains a top priority. We talked a lot about the risks and the challenges with urine-based collection site, close proximity in the waiting room, potentially spreading the virus. And even if it's not COVID, there's lots of other germs that are spreading. Sanitation concerns with heavily used restrooms, inability to adhere to physical distancing practices. And of course, with the rapid oral fluid testing, the donor is observed, the donor is doing all of the collecting, so nobody's in touch with or in touching any saliva. PPE can absolutely be worn and maintained, although probably not necessary. The test administrator can remain a safe distance, that CDC recommended 6 feet. The donor is sealing everything. We can have gloves on, we can take additional measures, but really this is a safe way to perform that drug test, because I think one of the most dangerous things that could happen right now, especially considering this crisis within a crisis that we're in, is that companies just decide to stop drug testing, which could be catastrophic for their businesses. This offers a way to do it much more safely. And so, again, with the ongoing spread of the virus, employers are being challenged with the need to find safer and reliable drug screening options. And again, it becomes more and more challenging to leverage the collection sites, particularly because we're hearing, again, of a lot of them either closing, limiting hours, or even limiting the types of services performed. So some of them just are not doing drug testing right now. This outlines, I think the visuals are maybe helpful here too. As you can see in the 3 images, this is the donor doing all of the work herself. So again, the test administrator or the employee of the client is not at all coming in contact with saliva. We talked about the crisis within a crisis, but again, I think the COVID pandemic has set us back so far in terms of the opioid crisis in which we were kind of in the middle of. And like we talked about, right, it's companies aren't necessarily worried about people using THC and what effect that has in the workplace outside of being under the influence while at work. But the real challenge becomes when people are addicted to prescription pain pills and narcotics with oxycodone at $80 a pill. At some point, the money train runs out and you have to steal to support your habit. And so, again, one of the worst things we can do right now is stop or start to limit the drug testing that we're doing, because it's more important now than ever. We have a couple of slides just in terms of some statistics and the importance of drug testing and workplace theft. Again, especially when you're talking to retailers, their concern is shrinkage, and narcotics are expensive. And heroin, fentanyl, all these things are getting more and more expensive. And so we have this in this bullet right here: recreational marijuana smoker is less likely compelled to steal to support their habit compared to those abusing the harder drugs that they need cash so they can get well, meaning to feel better so they can go through their day because of addiction. 58% admitted to using drugs with a coworker, and 41% purchased them from someone at work. 70% of the estimated 14.8 million Americans who use illicit drugs are employed. Employees that are abusing illicit substances are 3.5 times as likely to have an accident on the job. and only 58% of people with an opioid use disorder have the same employer throughout the previous year. So again, the importance of testing frequently. These are some slides here, of course, on employee theft and addiction. 7 in 10 Americans have used drugs while at work, including opiates and amphetamines and cocaine. Retail fraud and drug-driven retail fraud rings have been discovered, and the police say that they're on the rise. This is an interesting story here. I think it was at a major big box retailer, but 7-year-old woman was arrested for paying heroin addicts to steal from a number of major big box retailers and then fence the stolen items out of her bar. One of the questions that we always get is how companies are handling THC testing. So I talked about it a little bit earlier, and I know we're getting to the 45-minute mark, so I'm going to kind of whip through this. But again, it's a question that I get every day. Companies want to know, can they remove THC from the panel, which I'll add is an option with oral tox. We make a lot of panels for a lot of larger companies, especially that want to include oxy, opiates, cocaine, meth, amphetamines, but they don't want THC on the panel. And so I think another challenge is that sometimes we tend to think of THC testing as synonymous with drug testing. And while employers may not be as concerned anymore with recreational THC use, meaning at nights and on the weekends, they certainly are concerned with the narcotics and the drugs that are leading to all these statistics that we went through. So it's important to note the difference that when we're talking about drug testing, we're not really talking about THC testing. We're talking about these other drugs that are driving the theft and crime on the street. Kind of what I'm going to wrap up with here is one of the biggest reservations or hesitations that I get from prospects when introducing rapid oral fluid testing is that, okay, yeah, it's great. It makes a lot of sense. I can save money and I can get people to work, but I'm not comfortable with my employees reading the test results and making these determinations. That's why we send them out to the collection site so that we don't have to deal with it and take on that liability. We developed the OT Scan mobile reader, which is an iOS-based app that is an algorithm that actually interprets the drug test result. So there's no read of the employee of is there a line, is there not a line. The algorithm actually reads the result and feeds it through our laboratory information system, fully automating the process. So what I'm most excited, it's kind of twofold of what I'm excited for with the OT Scan. The first is that, again, we can automate that interpretation and take the subjectivity out of the test. It's not, is there a line, is there not a line? It's not, I'm worried that my test administrator is going to have a friend or a neighbor come in and, maybe it looks like a positive, but they're just going to say it's a negative. We can eliminate that fear. And secondly, and maybe this is even more important, the app integrates with the applicant tracking system. So ultimately, we can conduct a drug test, have that interpreted through a reader, and that result can be populated back into that applicant tracking system within minutes. So in under 5 minutes, which I think is a big reason why people go with either lab-based oral fluid or traditional collection sites, is for that integration piece so that all of the data is there. And it's somewhat of a challenge with a rapid result of how do you document that the drug test took place. So with the OT Scan, I think it accomplishes absolutely everything while offering those benefits we said initially with saving time and money. Obviously, if you're using any type of rapid device, you want to make sure you're using an FDA cleared solution, just so that oral tox is FDA cleared, and we have the only clearance lab-based or point of care for oxycodone. So this is a couple of screenshots. So essentially, the way that the rapid test works is that the donor, again, donor-driven process, puts the swab in their mouth. The collector stem turns red when you have enough oral fluid, so it takes the guesswork out. They put the testing swab back into the device, and the results start to wick up the strips. We then log into the app, and the test administrator would do this, in which it interprets those results. So I'll actually show you some screenshots here. So up here, we're going to scan the barcode. Every device has its own unique QR code. which ties into a specific lot number, expiration date, this actual product, not just the lot number, as well as the testing configuration. You enter in the donor details, indicating the reason for the test. So it defaults to pre-employment, but you can also select post-accident reasonable cause. We have a spot for donor consent language. And the read itself, so you click on this button here that says read the test, and it's almost like depositing a check online. So it's the red, yellow, green. When you start to focus it, it looks red. As you get closer, it turns yellow. And then once you've captured everything, it turns green. And it's a really slick process. That then automatically populates the results. Nothing is stored on the phone, so it's immediately swiped from the phone and goes into a HIPAA compliant portal, which, like I said, can also tie into your applicant tracking system within seconds. And so, again, ultimately, we can conduct a drug test, maintain that 6 feet of separation, do it safely. Donor is driving the process, so we don't have any contact with it, and have that result back in our applicant tracking system within minutes. This outlines that process here and exactly how that interface works. And like I said, the algorithm actually feeds it through our laboratory information system, which there are, in this webinar, we didn't really go through all the unique state laws, but as some of you may know, there's like 600 unique state laws as it relates to drug testing. Some states like Minnesota, New York, and Nevada have clinical lab laws, which require the results to be overseen by a certified laboratory. We have legal opinion, and we believe that in using the OSCAN app or the OT-SCAN app, because it's essentially a lab-developed test and the algorithm is feeding through our laboratory information system, that would check those boxes and make point of care or rapid testing a viable solution in those states, which is a game changer for a lot of companies. So with that, I think I apologize if I raced through those last couple of slides, but I wanted to make sure we got through before 10:45, 12:45 here. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the AccuSource team to go through any questions.
Thank you, Casey. Now we will dedicate the remainder of the webinar to addressing attendee questions. If you have not had a chance to ask a question via our chat box, please feel free to do so now.
Thanks, Heidi. The first question is with testing for THC, will it only show positive for recent use?
So great question. In a rapid oral fluid test, you're limited to up to 24 hours after use. So as opposed to urine testing, which we know it sticks around longer, it doesn't stick around for a recreational user as long as we sometimes think, as far as like a month. But we are absolutely limited to up to 24 hours and maybe even less with the rapid oral fluid test.
Thank you. The second question is, I have heard that THC does not show up in oral fluid. Is that true?
Again, so it's like we mentioned, it's fat soluble, not water soluble. So it doesn't cross into the oral fluid as a metabolite or a byproduct. We have to actually test for residual parent drug. And so for that reason, that's why we have that more limited window of detection of up to 24 hours. And again, more realistically in practice, it's probably less than that. So it's certainly, I tell people if THC is, what you're most concerned about, you absolutely will miss some with a rapid oral fluid test. However, we see higher positivity rates overall with oral fluid testing because we prevent that cheating. So it's kind of a balance of balancing out those advantages and limitations.
All right, another one based around marijuana. With legalization of marijuana, our organization is discussing removing THC from the testing panel. Is this something that you are seeing from other companies?
Absolutely. So I think I mentioned I get calls and the company gets calls multiple times every day, but I'm personally pulled into it probably a few times a week minimum with companies that are still very dedicated and they want to make sure they're testing for the narcotics and the prescription drugs, the oxycodones, the opiates, the methamphetamine, but they're less concerned with THC, especially because of legalization. And so we have a number of unique panels. We have some 5, 6, 7, 8 panels that all have THC removed. The other option that companies are taking advantage of as well is just because THC has a limited window of detection in rapid oral fluid, it's a good solution for if you want to know, what's going on right now, if someone coming to work high versus, what did they do over the weekend. So some companies choose to still test for it just because they want to make sure that people aren't under the influence at work, and others have just removed it entirely.
Okay. It sounds like you may have already answered this one, but we'll read it off again. Can OSCAN integrate results into my applicant tracking system?
Yes. So I think that's really the key to this being effective, is that it's not just the fact of automating the interpretation and taking the subjectivity out of the test. For it to be a real full solution, it has to be able to integrate, to be able to accomplish what companies can get from the traditional lab-based testing and the integration that's achieved there, as well as laboratory-based oral fluid testing. So yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. Casey, this will be our final live question. Again, attendees, if you entered a question into the chat box and we didn't have the opportunity to address it live, our team will follow up with you directly post-webinar to provide an answer. The final question, Casey, is urine testing or oral fluid testing more accurate?
So it's a good question. And I think the way to describe it, if you look in just comparison to confirmation testing, so how does an oral fluid test compare to a confirmation test, and the same for urine? Urine is like 99%, oral fluid is like 97%. But I think, again, the biggest difference between the two is their advantages and limitations. So, oral fluid provides the option to, or provides the advantage of being able to be resistant to adulteration. So we see true positives because people can't cheat the test, whereas maybe that goes unseen in a urine test because somebody put a little bleach underneath their fingernail or they drank a lot of water. So we'll see more true positives with oral fluid testing. Or if we're talking about THC again, maybe we see a higher which we do, higher positivity rate for THC in urine versus oral fluid. So it's hard to say which one is more accurate. It's that there's different advantages and limitations which make them not an apples to apples comparison.
Thank you, Casey, for facilitating this informative webinar, and special thanks to our attendees for joining us today.